The Cold War's darkest secret. In the quiet suburban landscape of Menlo Park, California, a man named Frank Olson fell from a 10th-floor window of the Statler Hotel in New York City on a chilly morning in November 1953. The official verdict was suicide, a tragic end for a man described as a devoted husband, a doting father, and a brilliant biological warfare researcher for the U.S. Army. Case closed. But in the shadowed hallways of the newly established Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, in the very heart of the Cold War machine, the news of Olson's death was not the end of a tragedy, but the ominous opening chapter of one of the darkest, most audacious secrets in American history. For Frank Olson had not simply suffered a sudden breakdown. He had been an unwilling subject in a clandestine experiment, dosed with a powerful, mind-altering drug by his own colleagues in the name of national security. Olson's death, whispered about in hushed tones as an operational mishap, was merely one tiny tragic pinprick on a sprawling multi-million-dollar canvas of psychological warfare research. It was a project that spanned 2 decades, corrupted more than 80 American and Canadian institutions, including prestigious universities, hospitals, and prisons, and involved the non-consensual use of psychoactive drugs, electroshock, hypnosis, and sensory deprivation on thousands of human beings. Its codename was clinical, dry, and utterly chilling. Project MK Ultra. For the American public of the 1950s, the national psyche was already frayed by the fear of communism. The specter of brainwashing, a term popularized by the perceived ideological conversion of American POWs during the Korean War, had gripped the nation. Hollywood thrillers and paperback novels fueled a collective paranoia. Could foreign enemies, the Soviets, the Chinese, possess a secret technique to seize control of an American citizen's mind, turning a loyal patriot into an unwitting assassin or a double agent? The CIA, only 6 years old and already flexing its muscle in covert foreign policy, was terrified by this possibility. Their internal fear was that the enemy had already weaponized the mind. The solution, to the agency's top-tier scientists and spy masters, was clear. America must get there first. They had to master the science of coercive control, the ability to break a mind down and rebuild it to defend the nation. This wasn't simply about gathering intelligence. It was about nothing less than gaining the ultimate advantage, total control over human behavior. This is the true story of how that fear, fueled by a blank check and almost zero oversight, became an illegal, unethical, and destructive campaign waged against the very people the CIA was sworn to protect, U.S. and Canadian citizens. Part 1. The Genesis of Control, 1945 to 1953. Chapter 1. The Nuremberg Echo and the Blueprint for Bluebird. The moral foundation of human experimentation was supposed to have been set in stone at the close of World War II. The Nuremberg Code, born from the horrors of Nazi medical experiments, established the inviolable principle of informed consent, that a human subject must voluntarily agree to participate after being fully informed of the risks. The men who would pioneer the CIA's mind control projects, however, viewed this code not as a moral boundary, but as a bureaucratic obstacle. The roots of MK Ultra stretch back through a lineage of increasingly aggressive covert programs, each one escalating the ethical transgression. It began in the immediate post-war years with Operation Paperclip, a controversial U.S. government program that recruited more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians, many with histories in the Nazi Party and even involvement in atrocities, to work for the American military. Among them were experts in aerodynamics, rocketry, and critically, chemical and biological warfare. The rationale was simple: better to have their knowledge than let it fall into Soviet hands. This influx of personnel brought with it a different, more callous ethical framework toward human experimentation. The first official CIA-sanctioned program focused on mind control was Project Bluebird, authorized in 1950 by CIA Director Roscoe Hillenkotter. The initial aim was defensive, to prevent unauthorized extraction of information from them by known or imagined means of control. This quickly morphed into a more offensive mission under its successor program, Project Artichoke, authorized by the powerful new Director of Central Intelligence, DCI, Allen Dulles, in 1951.
Project Artichoke explicitly focused on developing and testing specialized interrogation methods, including the use of hypnosis and drugs to induce amnesia or to force confessions. The Artichoke teams were deployed in secret safe houses overseas, testing techniques on suspected agents and detainees. The ethical slide was already accelerating. Internal memos from this era are chillingly explicit, describing the search for a drug or technique that could create a state of controllable dissociation in a subject, making them pliable, compliant, and ultimately manipulable. The line between interrogation and psychological torture had dissolved entirely. Chapter 2: Sidney Gottlieb and the Age of Psychochemicals. To truly unlock the secrets of the mind, Dulles needed a scientist willing to operate outside the boundaries of established law and ethics. He found him in Dr. Sidney Gottlieb. A brilliant, club-footed chemist, Gottlieb was the head of the CIA's Technical Services Division, TSD, and by all accounts, a man of profound contradictions. He was a vegetarian, a devotee of Eastern philosophy, and an environmentalist who lived on a farm. Yet, he became the architect of the agency's most dangerous psychochemical weapons program, nicknamed the Black Alchemist. Gottlieb believed the key to mind control lay in chemistry. In the late 1940s, a new, unbelievably potent drug had emerged from a Swiss lab, lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD-25. First synthesized by Albert Hofmann, LSD was initially viewed by the medical community as a potential tool to model psychosis. The CIA, however, saw it as a potential truth serum, or even better, a mind breaker. A single dose, so small it was invisible to the naked eye, could induce a hallucinogenic, often terrifying 12-hour journey into the abyss of the unconscious. Gottlieb became obsessed with LSD. He was given a massive operational budget and near total autonomy by Dulles. In 1953, he proposed a broad, systemic research program far larger and more clandestine than anything before it. It would be an umbrella for more than 150 sub-projects, encompassing drugs, biological agents, hypnosis, electroshock, and sensory deprivation. This was the birth of Project MK-Ultra. The program's objectives, as later revealed in declassified memos, were staggering in their ambition and lack of moral restraint. They sought to develop substances that would promote illogical thinking and impulsiveness to the point where the recipient would be utterly discredited in public, increase the efficiency of mentation and perception, essentially a cognitive booster, induce pure confusion, memory loss, and mental blankness, produce a temporary or permanent physical disabler, create a truth serum that would compel the subject to offer information against their will, cause dependence followed by a total, uncontrollable craving, cause amnesia for events preceding and during their use. The very first large-scale subject pool for these frightening objectives was deemed necessary: the unwitting American public. Chapter 3: The Safe Houses and the Street People. Gottlieb's LSD experiments were carried out in multiple settings, but the most infamous were the clandestine safe houses in New York City and San Francisco. These were designated as Operation Midnight Climax. The operation, run by a retired Federal Narcotics Bureau agent named George Hunter White, was designed to test the efficacy of LSD and other drugs on unsuspecting citizens in real-world scenarios. White, a colorful character who embraced the seedy underworld with gusto, outfitted a safe house in a Greenwich Village apartment with two-way mirrors and concealed recording equipment. His subjects were largely marginalized members of society, prostitutes, drifters, drug users, and others who he believed could be discreetly and permanently silenced if the experiments went awry. The agent's method was disturbingly simple. They would bring unwitting civilians back to the apartment, dose their drinks with LSD, and observe the resultant breakdown of their personality and inhibitions from behind the glass. The goal was to see how the drug affected motor control, lucidity, and the ability to maintain secrets in a compromised state. White's logs, later uncovered, detailed the lurid and horrifying effects, often with a detached clinical cruelty. One log entry might read, "Subject ingested 100 mics, began raving incoherently about persecution, became paranoid, then violent, attempted to smash the mirror, which was of course the one-way mirror, had to be restrained. Observation terminated at 0400 hours." The ethical violation here was total. Not only were people being drugged against their will, but their deepest psychological distress was being weaponized and recorded for the state. The fact that this was all happening on American soil, targeting American citizens, was a profound and illegal abuse of the CIA's foreign intelligence mandate.
The death of Frank Olson, the Army scientist mentioned earlier, was a direct result of this reckless mindset. Olson had been given LSD in a drink during a TSD retreat, allegedly as an experiment on the drug's effects on personnel. The drug provoked an extreme psychotic reaction and paranoia. A few days later, while being monitored in New York by a CIA doctor who was not a psychiatrist, Olson plunged to his death. The Olson tragedy was a warning sign, a flash of lightning on a dark road, but the CIA, desperate for a breakthrough, merely dug in deeper. Olson's family was lied to for decades, only receiving a meager settlement years later after the truth, or at least a fragment of it, began to surface. For Gottlieb and Dulles, the only lesson learned was to be more careful about record-keeping and more clandestine about the unwitting subjects. Part 2. The Global Network of Subprojects, 1954 to 1963. Chapter 4. LSD, the Universal Key to the Psyche. While the safe houses provided the raw data from street tests, the bulk of MKUltra was conducted in institutions, providing the program with a veneer of scientific legitimacy. Over 80 institutions, universities, hospitals, and prisons across North America were secretly funded by the CIA, often through complex, obfuscated financial conduits like the Human Ecology Fund. The researchers, many of them respected academics, were given huge grants and told the work was for national defense. They were simply not told who was actually funding it or the nature of the unwitting experiments. LSD remained the centerpiece of the pharmaceutical subprojects. In the search for a perfect truth serum, or a method of breaking down a subject's will, the researchers experimented with various administration methods, dosages, and combinations with other substances, including barbiturates, mescaline, and even heroin. In hospitals and prisons, MKUltra subjects included patients admitted for minor illnesses, federal inmates, and often the mentally ill, who were viewed as particularly expendable and whose subsequent accounts of the experiments could easily be dismissed as delusions. At the Federal Narcotics Hospital in Kentucky, inmates volunteered for drug tests in exchange for parole consideration, unaware of the extreme, non-therapeutic dosages and the total lack of medical oversight from their secret sponsors. One of the most ethically egregious drug studies involved an MKUltra subproject where 7 Kentucky convicts were kept on LSD for 77 straight days. Their accounts, later declassified, describe a protracted, agonizing experience of continuous hallucination, paranoia, and psychological collapse. The subjects were reduced to panicked, paranoid and often violent states, a terrifying living example of the weaponized mind the CIA was attempting to create. Chapter 5: Dr. Cameron and the Mind Wipe. Perhaps the most notorious and destructive single sub-project of MK-Ultra took place far north of the border, at the Allen Memorial Institute of Psychiatry at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. Here, Dr. Ewan Cameron, a world-renowned Scottish-born psychiatrist, conducted experiments that were so extreme that they would permanently shatter the lives of his patients. Cameron's theory, one the CIA was extremely interested in, was that mental illness could be cured by first obliterating the diseased personality and then repatterning the mind with a new, healthy one. To achieve this psychic driving and depatterning, Cameron devised a three-part protocol of unparalleled brutality, funded directly by the CIA's MK-Ultra budget, Subproject 68. 1. Induced sleep and drug cocktails. Patients, many admitted for minor illnesses like anxiety or postpartum depression, were put into a chemically induced deep sleep for weeks, sometimes months at a time. They were administered massive, non-therapeutic doses of sedatives, barbiturates, and paralytics. This regimen was intended to completely erase their consciousness and their memory. The results were not mind control or repatterning. They were utter destruction. Patients were left incontinent, mute, suffering from permanent amnesia, and completely unable to function. They forgot their families, how to speak, and how to perform basic tasks. They had been physically and psychologically broken by a respected doctor with the secret funding of the American government in an attempt to weaponize their mental capacity. The sheer scale and cruelty of the Cameron experiments were a clear, catastrophic failure of the MK-Ultra mission, yet they continued for years, shielded by the secrecy of the Cold War and the blank check of the CIA. Part 3: The Fall and the Aftermath, 1964 to 1977. Chapter 6: The Winding Down and the Burning of Records. By the mid-1960s, Project MK-Ultra was losing momentum. After more than a decade of research, Gottlieb and his superiors had to face a hard truth. They had failed to create a reliable truth serum or a method of controllable mind wiping. LSD was too unpredictable, the electroshock too destructive, and the hypnotic conditioning too unreliable for use in a controlled operational environment. The dream of a Manchurian candidate, an asset controlled by a single word or signal, remained firmly in the realm of fiction. However, a new threat emerged, not from the Soviet Union, but from within the U.S. government. In the early 1970s, the nation was reeling from the revelations of the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal, leading to a profound crisis of public faith in government institutions. The CIA itself was coming under intense scrutiny for its foreign assassinations and domestic spying activities. In 1973, fearing that the program's illegal activities, especially the experiments on unwitting American citizens, would be exposed, Director of Central Intelligence Richard Helms issued a catastrophic order: destroy all MK-Ultra records. Helms, a veteran spy deeply committed to the secrecy of the agency, wanted to ensure that the CIA's blackest secrets would never see the light of day. Sidney Gottlieb, the Black Alchemist, personally oversaw the destruction of the vast majority of the program's files. Thousands of pages of operational logs, financial documents, and scientific data were systematically shredded and burned. The CIA had not only destroyed the lives of its victims, but had now attempted to destroy the very record of its crimes, making the truth virtually impossible to piece together. Chapter 7: The Church Committee and the Fragments of Truth. Helms's desperate act of institutional self-preservation ultimately failed to completely bury the truth. The Watergate crisis led to unprecedented congressional inquiries into government intelligence overreach. In 1975, the U.S. Senate formed the Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities, known popularly as the Church Committee, after its chairman, Senator Frank Church of Idaho. At the same time, President Gerald Ford established the Rockefeller Commission to investigate domestic CIA activities. These investigations were hampered by the lack of documentation, but investigators got their first break when they discovered a tiny cache of ledgers that had been mistakenly filed in the wrong place and survived Helms's purge. These fragments confirmed the code name, the scope, and the existence of the funding shell, the Human Ecology Fund, that had been used to pay for the experiments. The Church Committee, relying on these sparse documents and the often reluctant testimony of former CIA personnel like Sidney Gottlieb and Alan Dulles, began to construct the horrifying truth. The committee's 1975 report revealed the existence of the mind control program and its core nature: the extensive use of LSD and other drugs on unwitting subjects, the funding of institutional research, and the destruction of the bulk of the records. For the American public, the revelations were a profound shock. The government, in the name of fighting an external enemy, had turned its darkest weapons inward, violating fundamental constitutional and moral principles. The fear of brainwashing was real, but the perpetrator was not the Soviet Union, it was the Central Intelligence Agency. Chapter 8. Echoes of the Victims. The initial media frenzy of the 1970s faded, but the devastation left by MKUltra on its victims did not. The surviving documentation, particularly regarding Dr. Cameron's experiments in Canada, allowed some victims and their families to realize that the psychological trauma, memory loss, and lifelong incapacitation they suffered were not due to personal illness, but to state-sponsored abuse. Dozens of victims of the Montreal experiments filed lawsuits against the CIA and the Canadian government. The case of Linda MacDonald, who was admitted for depression in 1963 and emerged years later with no memory of her parents or her husband, became a rallying point. She had been subjected to sensory deprivation, massive EST, and the psychic driving loops. The legal battles were arduous, lasting for decades. The CIA, while admitting to the program's existence, initially shielded itself behind the doctrine of sovereign immunity and classification. The U.S. government argued that the CIA had no legal authority to conduct experiments in Canada, essentially disclaiming responsibility. However, after intense public pressure and legal maneuvering, the U.S. government, under President Bill Clinton in the 1990s, made symbolic apologies and offered small financial settlements to some of the Canadian victims and the family of Frank Olson. For the vast majority of American victims, the lack of documentation meant they would never know the truth. People who suffered unexplained psychotic breaks in the 1950s and 60s, individuals who ended up institutionalized after a night out in Greenwich Village, or veterans who volunteered for drug tests in military facilities, their suffering remained unacknowledged, their medical records forever incomplete, the cause of their trauma lost in the flames of Richard Helm's 1973 document purge. Part 4. The Enduring Legacy of Control. Chapter 9. The Torture Blueprint and Kubark. The official end of MKUltra in the mid-1970s did not mean the techniques and research disappeared. The data gathered during the 2 decades of illegal experiments, particularly the study of how to induce sensory deprivation, psychological pain, and identity breakdown, were formalized and disseminated within the intelligence community. The information on coercive techniques was distilled into the Kubark Counterintelligence Interrogation Manual, published by the CIA in 1963. Kubark outlined the principles of interrogation using coercive techniques, noting that the complete breakdown of a subject's sensory and mental landscape, achieved through techniques like prolonged isolation, sensory deprivation, the clean slate effect, and stress positions, was the most effective way to secure compliance. Decades later, during the War on Terror following the attacks of September 11, 2001, these techniques resurfaced. The controversial Enhanced Interrogation Techniques, EITs, used by the CIA on detainees at secret black sites were strikingly similar to the coercive methodologies pioneered in MKUltra, including waterboarding, simulating drowning, stress positions, sensory deprivation, and sleep deprivation. The long shadow of MKUltra thus stretched from the paranoid Cold War 1950s into the modern era of counterterrorism. The unethical experiments conducted on unwitting citizens had inadvertently created the playbook for later government-sanctioned torture. The methods, which were deemed scientific failures in the search for mind control, proved to be horrifyingly effective at breaking the human will. Chapter 10. The American Conscience. The true legacy of MKUltra lies not just in the damaged lives or the interrogation techniques, but in the profound corrosion of the American ideal. The project's very existence demonstrated a horrifying truth that in the heat of the Cold War, a powerful faction of the U.S. government was willing to discard the basic tenets of democracy, the sanctity of the human mind, and the rights of its own people. The story of the CIA's hidden mind experiments is a cautionary tale for the American audience. It is a story about the danger of unchecked power and the corrosive effect of fear. It shows how the pursuit of a perceived technological or psychological advantage can justify the unthinkable. Today, while the CIA officially apologizes for the ethical failures of MKUltra, the full truth remains elusive, locked away in the burned and shredded documents of 1973. The vast majority of the victims will never receive justice or even an explanation. But the fear that drove the project, the fear of control, of an invisible enemy manipulating reality, has never truly gone away. It lives in the popular culture, informing books like The Manchurian Candidate and shows like Stranger Things, and fueling a continuing deep-seated distrust of the intelligence community. The story of MKUltra reminds the American public that the greatest threats to liberty are sometimes born not from foreign enemies, but from the dark corners of their own government, operating in secret and in the name of ultimate security. The Unmaking of the American Mind was a tragedy written by the CIA itself, and its final chapter remains unwritten, a persistent, chilling question mark in the nation's history.